The dust of Redemption Creek tasted of failure. Theda felt it on her tongue, a gritty film that coated the back of her throat, no matter how often she swallowed. It was the same dust that settled on the hem of her worn gray dress, that clouded the air in the single street, and that seemed to work its way into the soul of the town itself. She stood beside the motionless stagecoach, one hand resting on the small, bony shoulder of her 7-year-old son, Thomas. Everything they owned was in a single battered carpet bag at her feet. The town stared. It was not a hostile stare, not yet. It was a flat, curious, assessing gaze that catalogued her mended cuffs, the weary lines around her eyes, and the defiant set of her jaw. They saw a widow, alone, with a child to feed and no prospects. They saw a burden. The whispers started before the stagecoach driver had even tossed her bag into the dirt. They came from the women gathered near the mercantile, their faces shadowed by bonnets and self-righteousness. "Too proud," one murmured, her shoulder carrying on the dry breeze. "Look at her. Stands there like a queen with an empty purse." Theda heard it. She was meant to hear it. She was supposed to shrink, to look down, to perform the proper humility of the destitute. Instead, she lifted her chin a fraction higher, her grip on Thomas's shoulder a silent promise. They mistook dignity for pride, and resilience for arrogance. They did not know that her pride was all she had left, the last unbroken thing she carried. Her husband Samuel had died with the fever on the trail, leaving her with a son to raise and a future that had dissolved into this dusty, unwelcoming present. They had been headed for the promise of land, of a new start. Now she was the one left to finish the journey. Stranded in a place that had already passed judgment, she had a few dollars left. Enough for a week's worth of flour and beans, not enough for a room at the boarding house where the judging eyes would follow her every move. She asked the mercantile owner, a man with a drooping mustache and wary eyes, if there was any place a woman and her boy could shelter. "Not for charity," she'd added, her voice low but firm, "for work." He'd grunted, gesturing vaguely toward the edge of town. "There's an old line shack out past the creek. Belongs to the Circle N, but no one's used it in years. Roof probably leaks." He hadn't offered it. He'd simply stated its existence, leaving the rest to her. It was a dismissal, a way of pushing her to the margins where she wouldn't be the town's problem. Theda had nodded, a single sharp dip of her head. "Thank you," she said, the words costing her more than the last of her coffee money. She bought a small sack of flour and some salt, picked up her bag, and led Thomas away from the stairs, toward the edge of town and whatever ruin awaited them. The line shack was worse than she'd imagined. It was a skeleton of a cabin, bleached gray by the sun and wind. Gaps in the chinking grinned like missing teeth, and a section of the roof had collapsed inward, leaving a gaping hole to the unforgiving sky. But it had 4 walls, mostly, and a floor that was more dirt than wood. It was shelter. It was a start. Thomas, his face pale with exhaustion, looked up at her, his eyes wide with a question she could not answer. "Is this home now, Mama?" She knelt, forcing a smile that felt brittle on her lips. "This is our fortress, Thomas. We can make it strong." For the next week, she worked. She used mud and dried grass to patch the walls. She scavenged fallen branches and used Samuel's old knife to weave a crude patch for the roof. She swept the dirt floor until it was hard and smooth. Every evening, she would build a small fire outside and make flatbread. The smell of wood smoke and baking flour, a small comfort in the vast, lonely landscape. She did not go back into town. She did not ask for help. She simply endured, her silence a rebuke to their gossip. And the town watched. They saw the thin curl of smoke from her chimney and whispered that she was too proud to ask for a real job, too stubborn to accept her station. They did not see the blisters on her hands or the ache in her back. They saw only the pride they had decided was her defining sins. The storm came without warning, a bruised purple mass that rolled in over the mountains and broke upon the valley with a fury that felt personal. Thunder cracked like a whip, and rain fell in solid, blinding sheets. Theda and Thomas huddled in the driest corner of the shack, a threadbare blanket pulled over their heads, as water streamed through her makeshift roof and turned the floor to mud. The wind shrieked, clawing at the little cabin as if trying to tear it from the earth. When dawn finally broke, the world was washed clean and broken. And along the road that ran past her shack, the fence belonging to the Circle and Ranch was a ruin. Posts were snapped like twigs. The wire snarled and tangled in the mud for nearly a quarter of a mile. Nate rode the fence line on a gray gelding, his face a mask of grim frustration. The storm had scattered a herd he was meant to be moving to summer pasture, and this broken fence was an open invitation for them to wander onto the main road or into the rough country where they'd be lost for good. His foreman and hands were already spread thin, tracking the strays. This was a job he didn't have the men or the time for. He was the largest ranch owner in the territory, a man whose word was law in Redemption Creek. But the land did not care about his reputation. It took what it wanted. He carried his power like a heavy coat, a necessary protection he'd put on after his wife, Eleanor, had died birthing their daughter. The loss had hollowed him out, leaving a core of guilt and cold resolve. He provided, he commanded, he endured. He did not feel. He saw the woman first, a slash of gray against the wet green of the prairie. She was standing by the road, looking not at him, but at the fence. Her hands were on her hips, her head tilted as she assessed the damage with an unnervingly practical gaze. He recognized her as the widow from the lion shack, the subject of the town's latest round of gossip. He'd heard Mrs. Gable clucking about her pride, her refusal to take on honest work like washing laundry or scrubbing floors. He felt a flicker of irritation. The last thing he needed was a gawker. He urged his horse forward, stopping a few feet from her. "Ma'am, this is private property." His voice was rough-clipped. He expected her to startle, to offer a flustered apology and scurry away. She did not. She turned to face him, her eyes a clear, steady gray that met his without flinching. There were smudges of dirt on her cheek, and her hands, though clean, were chapped and raw. "I see that," she said, her voice quiet but not weak. She gestured with her chin toward the tangled wire. "You've got a problem here." His irritation hardened. "I'm aware of my problems, Mrs." He trailed off, not knowing her name. "Theta," she supplied, "and I can fix it." The words hung in the damp air between them. Nate stared at her. She was slight, worn thin by hardship. Yet she spoke with an absolute certainty that was utterly confounding. He almost laughed. It was a ridiculous notion. Mending fence was brutal. Backbreaking work for strong men, not for a woman the town had labeled too proud to scrub a floor. "That's ranch work," he said, his tone dismissive. "It's work," she countered, her gaze unwavering, "and I need work. You need a fence." It was so simple, so direct, it disarmed him. There was no plea in her voice, no hint of desperation, just a plain statement of fact. He saw the boy, Thomas, watching from the doorway of the derelict shack. The boy's face was a mirror of his mother's solemn determination. Nate thought of his own daughter, Lily, safe in the main house with a paid housekeeper. A wave of something uncomfortable, something that felt dangerously like empathy, washed over him. He fought it down. Pity was a weakness. "I don't have tools to spare," he said, looking for an excuse. "I have what I need." Theda replied. She didn't. She had a rusty hand axe, a small shovel, and hands that were already calloused, but she would make it work. She had to. Nate looked from her steady face to the ruined fence and back again. Every instinct told him to say no, to ride on and find a proper solution. But something in her quiet refusal to be dismissed held him there. He was tired, his patience was worn thin, and against all reason. He heard himself say, "Fine, you fix that stretch from the creek to the big cottonwood. You fix it right, and I'll pay you. Fair wage." He didn't believe she could do it. He thought she would try for an hour, realize this impossibility of the task, and give up. He thought he was calling her bluff. He wheeled his horse around without another word and rode off, the creak of his saddle leather the only sound in the quiet morning. He did not see the small, determined nod Theta gave his retreating back before she turned and walked toward the shack to retrieve her meager tools. The work was a beast. The ground, saturated from the storm, was a thick, sucking mud that fought her every step. The first task was clearing the old, broken posts. Some she could wrestle from the ground with sheer leverage and stubbornness. Others were snapped off at the base, and she had to dig around them with her small shovel, her hands scooping out the thick clay until she could pry the splintered wood free. By noon, her back was a single, screaming knot of pain, and her hands were raw. Thomas brought her a cup of water and watched her with silent, worried eyes. "Are you all right, Mama?" he asked. She paused, wiping a muddy forearm across her brow, and gave him a smile that was mostly grit. "Just moving some wood, sweet boy. Go on back inside." She found new posts in a stand of young lodgepole pine near the creek. Hacking them down with the dull axe was a slow, punishing rhythm of chop, chop, breathe. Her arms trembled with the effort. She dragged them one by one to the fence-line, her boots sinking in the mud, leaving a trail of her struggle etched in the earth. She dug new holes, deeper and straighter than the originals, her whole body straining against the resistant soil. She learned the heft of the posts, the precise angle needed to set them so they would hold against the tension of the wire and the weight of a leaning steer. The sun beat down, drying the mud on her clothes and skin until she felt encased in a shell of earth. Late in the afternoon, Nate's foreman, a burly man named Jed, rode out to check on her. He'd come to scoff, sent by a skeptical boss. He found Theda, her face grim with effort, using a heavy rock to tamp the dirt around a newly set post. The post was plumb, set deep and solid. She was working on untangling the snarled wire, her slender fingers surprisingly strong as she worked the kinks and bends out of the metal. He watched, arms crossed over his chest, his expression shifting from derision to grudging respect. "You ain't quit yet," he observed, his voice a low rumble. "Don't plan to." Theda said without looking up from her work. Jed grunted, a sound that held a world of surprise. He stayed for another 10 minutes, watching her stretch a section of wire, using her own body weight to pull it taut before securing it to a post. She worked with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity with hard labor. This was not a woman who was too proud to work. This was a woman who knew nothing but. He turned his horse and rode back to the ranch house, his report to Nate consisting of a single, baffled sentence: "Boss, I think she's going to do it." Nate heard the report and felt a strange unease. He rode out himself at dusk, keeping to the low ridge that overlooked the creek. From there he could see her, a small, solitary figure moving in the fading light. She was still working, her movements slower now, but just as determined. The fence line was transforming. A long, straight, solid line of new posts now stood where the ruin had been. She was a silhouette against the bruised orange of the sunset, and in that moment, she looked less like a desperate widow and more like a force of nature. He watched until the darkness swallowed her, then turned his horse back toward the ranch. The image of her burned into his mind. He had misjudged her. He had misjudged her completely, and the realization sat uncomfortably in his gut. Theda finished the next day. The last post was set, the last stretch of wire pulled taut and stapled fast. The fence was not just repaired, it was stronger than it had been before the storm. It was a testament to her will, written in wood and wire across the land. She stood back, her body humming with exhaustion and a deep, fierce satisfaction. She had done it. She had met the challenge and won. She gathered her tools and walked back to the shack, her steps heavy but sure. She washed her hands and face in the creek, the cold water a balm on her aching muscles. Then she waited. Nate arrived an hour later. He didn't ride up to the shack. He dismounted by the new fence and walked its length, his hand running over the smooth pine of the posts, testing the tension of the wire. He was a man who understood the language of good work, and this fence spoke it fluently. He walked the entire quarter-mile stretch, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned and walked toward her. He stopped before her, holding out a small, heavy leather pouch. "Fair wage," he said. The same words as before, but they sounded different now. They were filled with a respect he could not voice. Theda took the pouch. It was heavier than she expected. Inside were silver dollars, more than enough to buy food for a month, more than she had seen in one place since Samuel died. It was more than a fair wage. It was an apology. "Thank you, mister," she said, her voice hoarse from dust and fatigue. "Nate," he corrected her quietly. "My name is Nate." For the first time, he truly looked at her, not at the widow or the gossip, but at the woman who had single-handedly rebuilt a piece of his world. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but underneath it he saw a strength that humbled him. Something shifted in the cold, quiet space where his heart used to be. It was a small, unsettling tremor, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. He nodded curtly, turned, and walked back to his horse, leaving her standing in the doorway of her broken-down home, the weight of the silver coins cool and solid in her palm. The coins were a beginning. The next morning, Jed, the foreman, appeared at her door. "Boss says there's more work if you want it," he said, avoiding her eyes. "The kitchen garden and the housemaids need tendin', and there's tack in the barn needs mendin'. Simple stuff." It was an offer of steady employment, a way to keep her close without upsetting the rigid order of the ranch. Theda accepted. It meant food on the table and a roof, however leaky, over their heads. Working at the circle ends was like entering another world. The main house was a grand, two-story structure made of stone and dark wood, a fortress of prosperity. It was Nate's world, and it was run with a quiet, efficient gloom. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Croft, showed Theda the sprawling, neglected garden and the pile of bridles and harnesses with cracked leather and broken stitching. Theda set to work with the same quiet competence she'd shown on the fence line. She weeded and tilled the garden, her hands finding a familiar comfort in the soil. She coaxed new life from the dormant vegetable plants. In the afternoons, she sat in the shade of the barn, the smell of leather and hay around her, carefully stitching the worn tack with an awl and waxed thread. Nate watched her. He would stand at the window of his study, which overlooked the garden, and watch her move between the rows of beans and squash. He told himself he was merely inspecting his property, but he knew it was a lie. He was drawn to her stillness, the way she could work for hours in a focused silence. He started leaving things for her. One morning, she arrived to find a new, sharp hoe and a sturdy pair of leather gloves sitting by the garden gate. Another day, a fresh-baked loaf of bread from the ranch kitchen was waiting on a bench in the barn. He never said a word, and she never acknowledged the gifts directly, but a silent conversation began between them, spoken in gestures of quiet provision and grateful acceptance. One evening, she stayed late to finish mending a particularly important saddle. She saw a light on in his study and, on impulse, walked to the main house and knocked on the back door. Mrs. Croft opened it, her face a mask of disapproval. "I need to speak with Mr. Nate," Theda said simply. The housekeeper reluctantly let her in, leading her to the study. Nate was at his desk, surrounded by a chaotic sprawl of papers. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Theda, is something wrong?" "Your ledgers," she said, gesturing to the stacks of paper. "They're a mess." It was a bold statement, bordering on insubordination, but she saw the weary frustration in his eyes and knew she was right. "I can read and write. I kept my father's books for his store back east. I can organize this for you." Nate stared at her, then at the mess on his desk. He was a cattleman, not a clerk. The paperwork was the part of his empire he hated most. He ran a hand through his hair. "I can't pay you more. You don't have to," she said. "A disorganized house is an unstable one. This ranch is feeding my son. I have an interest in its stability." For the second time, her blunt, practical logic cut through his defenses. He gave a short, sharp nod. "All right, show me." They worked side by side for the next week of evenings. Theda sorted the bills of sale, the receipts for feed and supplies, the wage chits for the hands. She created a system, labeling folders, entering figures into a new clean ledger book in her neat, clear hand. They barely spoke. The only sounds were the rustle of paper, the scratch of her pen, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. But the silence was not empty. It was filled with a growing awareness, a sense of two solitary people finding a strange comfort in a shared task. He would watch her hand move across the page, the way she bit her lip when concentrating. He noticed the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. He began to feel the thawing of the ice that had encased his heart for so long, and the sensation was terrifying. The true crack in his armor came in the form of his daughter Lily. She was 5 years old, a pale, silent child with her mother's dark hair and Nate's solemn eyes. Since Eleanor's death, Lily had retreated into a world of her own, rarely speaking, rarely smiling. She was a living, breathing embodiment of his failure, and he loved her with a fierce, helpless pain. He didn't know how to reach her. Theda's son Thomas was the key. He was a quiet boy, but not a silent one. He would follow his mother to the ranch and play by himself near the garden. One afternoon, Lily wandered out onto the porch and watched him. Thomas was trying to get a small wooden top to spin. After several failed attempts, he looked up and saw her. He held out the top. "Want to try?" Lily stared at him, then gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She walked down the steps and sat beside him. Theda watched from the garden, her heart aching for the lonely little girl. Over the next few days, a tentative friendship blossomed. Thomas showed Lily how to skip stones in the horse trough. Lily, in turn, showed him a secret clutch of robin's eggs in the big oak tree. Theda would sometimes hear the ghost of a laugh from the little girl, a sound Nate hadn't heard in years. Theda found herself drawn to the child, her maternal instincts overriding her caution. She started bringing an extra biscuit for Lily in the mornings. She would speak to her gently, asking about the robins or the color of a flower, never pushing for a response, just letting her voice be a warm, steady presence. One day, Lily was running to show Thomas a caterpillar she'd found when she tripped on an exposed tree root and fell hard, scraping her knee. The wail that tore from her was one of shock and pain. Nate came running from the barn, his face a mask of panic. Theda was there first. She knelt, scooping the crying child into her arms. "Shh, now, little one. It's all right. Let's have a look," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing hum. She held Lily close, rocking her gently. Nate stopped dead, watching them. He saw the way his daughter clung to Theda, burying her tear-streaked face in the crook of Theda's neck. He saw the way Theda's hand stroked Lily's hair, her touch infinitely gentle. He saw a natural, easy tenderness that he himself had forgotten how to give. "I'll take her," he said, his voice tight. He reached for his daughter. As he did, his hand brushed Theda's. It was the barest of contacts, skin against skin, but a jolt went through him, sharp and hot as a lightning strike. He froze. Theda looked up, her gray eyes wide with surprise, and for a breathless moment, they were trapped in a silence that was more intimate than any conversation. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a question, a vulnerability, a reflection of the same shock he felt. He snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. The need that surged through him, the sudden, overwhelming desire to lean into that warmth, to not be alone, terrified him. He took his daughter from her arms, his movements stiff and awkward, and carried her into the house without another word, leaving Theda kneeling in the dirt, her own heart hammering against her ribs. The town of Redemption Creek had a social order as rigid and unyielding as the prairie in winter, and its queen was Mrs. Beatrice Gable. She was the banker's wife, a woman whose pronouncements on morality and propriety were treated as gospel. From her perch on the mercantile porch, nothing escaped her notice, and she had noticed the widow Theda's continued presence at the Circle N with mounting disapproval. She had intended for her own niece, a bland and simpering girl from back east, to be the next Mrs. Nate. Theda's quiet competence was a threat to that plan. Mrs. Gable began her campaign subtly, with poisoned pleasantries. "Such a shame about that poor woman," she would sigh to the other ladies of the town. "So desperate, she has to do men's work." A woman's hands aren't made for fences and leather. The implication was clear. Theda was unnatural, unfeminine. When that failed to dislodge her, the attacks became more direct. "I do worry about that little Lily," she'd confide, her voice dripping with false concern. "Out there with a stranger all day, a woman with no people, no history. One can't be too careful." She needed ammunition, a piece of Theda's past to twist into a weapon. She found it in a letter from a cousin in a town 2 territories over, a town Theda and Samuel had passed through on their journey west. The letter mentioned a tragic bar fight, a man killed, and the subsequent hasty departure of several families, including a young couple with a small boy. It was a vague connection, a piece of gossip 2 times removed, but for Mrs. Gable it was enough. The story she wove was a masterpiece of malicious invention. Theda's husband, she whispered, hadn't died of fever. He'd been a gambler and a drunk, killed in a saloon brawl he himself had started. And Theda? She was no grieving widow. She was a saloon girl, a woman of loose morals who had fled her sullied reputation. The story spread from the church sewing circle to the general store, from the blacksmith's forge to the ranches in the valley. Each telling added a new lurid detail. By the time the rumor had fully taken root, Theda had been transformed from a proud widow into a dangerous adventuress, a Jezebel preying on the town's most eligible and vulnerable widower. Theda felt the change like a drop in temperature. Women who had started to nod at her in passing now turned their heads, clutching their children's hands as if she were a contagion. She walked into the mercantile to buy thread, and the owner, Mr. Harris, suddenly became very busy counting barrels in the back room, leaving her standing at the counter until she gave up and left. The whispers followed her, sharp and stinging as horseflies. She heard the words saloon girl and bar fight and felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. It didn't matter that it was a lie. In a town like Redemption Creek, a woman's reputation was as fragile as a robin's egg, and hers had just been crushed under the heel of a vicious rumor. She tried to ignore it, to hold her head high and continue her work. But the poison seeped into the circle. Ranch hands who had developed a grudging respect for her now watched her with leering curiosity. Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, treated her with open hostility, her lips perpetually pursed in a thin line of judgment. Theda felt herself shrinking, the small space she had carved out for herself, and Thomas collapsing around her. She saw the confusion in her son's eyes when other children were pulled away from him in the street, and her heart broke. The worst blow came from Nate. He heard the rumors, of course. Jed told him, his face grim. It's Mrs. Gable, boss, spinning a whole cloth of lies. Nate's first instinct was a flash of white-hot anger. He knew Theda. He knew her quiet strength, her unwavering integrity. But the anger was quickly smothered by a cold, familiar caution. He was a pillar of this community, his name, his ranch, his daughter's future. They were all tied to the town's perception of him. The whispers were not just about Theda. They were about him, about his judgment, about the woman he was allowing near his child. The wall he had built around his heart, the wall Theda had so patiently started to dismantle, went back up, brick by cold, heavy brick. He became distant, retreating into the closed-off man he had been before she arrived. The easy silences in the study were replaced by a stiff formality. He stopped coming to the window to watch her in the garden. He saw the hurt and confusion in her eyes and hated himself for it. But the fear for his reputation, for the stable world he had fought so hard to maintain, was stronger. He was a man who had lost everything once. He would not risk it again. Finally, he confronted her, not with an accusation, but with a coward's solution. He found her in the barn, her hands busy mending a bridle, her movements slow and heavy with the weight of the town's scorn. "Theda," he began, his voice strained. I think it might be best if you stopped working at the main house for a while." He couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at a point on the far wall. "The talk. It's not good for Lily to be around it." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stopped her work, the awl falling from her numb fingers. She had endured the town's cruelty, but this, from him, was a betrayal that cut to the bone. He believed them. Or, worse, he didn't believe them, but had chosen their lies over her truth because it was easier. He was sacrificing her to protect himself. All the warmth she had begun to feel for him turned to ice. "I see," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. She stood up, her movements stiff with a pain that went deeper than any physical exhaustion she had ever known. "I understand." She didn't wait for him to say more. She walked out of the barn, across the yard, and back down the path to the line shack, her back ramrod straight. She did not run. She would not give him, or the watching eyes of the ranch, the satisfaction. But once inside the flimsy walls of her shelter, with the door barred, she leaned against it and slid to the floor, the silent, racking sobs finally breaking free. He had broken something more than her heart. He had broken her hope. There was nothing left to do but leave. Redemption Creek had made it clear she was not welcome, and the one person she had thought might be her anchor had just cut the rope. That night, by the flickering light of a single tallow candle, Theda packed their meager belongings back into the carpet bag. Thomas watched her, his small face etched with a sorrow that made him look old beyond his years. "Are we leaving because of the things they say, Mama?" he asked. His voice small. Theda paused, her hand hovering over Samuel's worn shirt. She knelt in front of her son and took his hands in hers. "We're leaving because this isn't our home," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We'll find our home somewhere else. I promise." It was a promise she had no idea how to keep. She had thought for a fleeting, foolish moment that she had already found it. The connection she had felt with Nate, the fragile, unspoken thing that had been growing between them, was now just another ruin in the landscape of her life. The morning sky was a strange, ominous yellow. A hot, dry wind blew from the east, carrying the scent of distant smoke and parched earth. The air was heavy, charged with a nervous energy that set the horses stamping in the corral. Theda planned to leave at first light, to walk the 10 miles to the next settlement before the sun reached its zenith. She was giving Thomas a last piece of flatbread when a frantic shout echoed from the direction of the Circle N. A ranch hand galloped past her shack, his face pale with panic, yelling one word over and over. "Fire!" Theda stepped outside. On the eastern ridge, a plume of dark smoke billowed into the sky, ugly and menacing. The wind was driving it straight toward the ranch, straight toward the dry grasslands of the valley. A wildfire. She had seen one once as a child, a terrifying, unstoppable wall of flame that had consumed everything in its path. Panic flared in her chest, cold and sharp, but it was immediately replaced by a surge of something else. A cold, clear-headed focus born of a lifetime of surviving crises. She could run. She could grab Thomas and her bag and head west, away from the danger. It was the sensible thing to do. The town had cast her out. Nate had rejected her. They owed her nothing, and she owed them nothing in return. But then she thought of Lily, of the small, silent girl who was just beginning to find her voice. She thought of the ranch, the place that had offered her a brief, shining moment of hope. She could not just turn her back and let it all burn. She told Thomas to stay inside the shack, to put a wet cloth over his face if the smoke got bad. Then she ran, not away from the fire, but toward it. At the ranch, chaos reigned. Men were shouting, running in circles, their efforts disorganized and futile. Some were throwing buckets of water that evaporated before they even hit the ground. Others were trying to drive the panicked cattle from the nearest pasture. Nate was in the middle of it all, his face black with soot, shouting orders that were lost in the roar of the wind and the approaching flames. He looked like a man watching his world end. Theda grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Nate, your men are wasting time," he spun around, his eyes wild. Seeing her, he looked momentarily confused, as if she were a ghost. "Theda, what are you doing here? You need to get out." "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through his panic. "There's a dry creek bed about a half-mile east of here. It runs north to south. If you can get your men there, you can start a backfire. Burn the grass between the creek and the wildfire. When the two fires meet, they'll run out of fuel and die." It was a desperate gamble, a tactic she'd heard her father, a man who knew the land, talk about years ago. It was dangerous. If the wind shifted, they could be trapped. Jed, the foreman, overheard her. He spat on the ground. "That's crazy talk. We'll lose the whole east pasture. It's a woman's panic, boss, that's all." Some of the other men grumbled in agreement, looking at Theda with a mixture of fear and contempt. They saw a hysterical woman, not a strategist. Nate looked from Jed's angry, fearful face to Theda's. Her eyes were clear, steady, and utterly certain. There was no panic in them, only a fierce, intelligent resolve. In that moment, he saw everything with a blinding clarity. He saw the rumors for the poison they were. and his own cowardice for the failure it was. He was about to lose everything: his ranch, his home, the legacy he was meant to protect. And the one person offering him a sliver of hope was the woman he had cast aside to appease the very people who were now watching his world burn. He was done being a coward. "No," Nate said, his voice ringing with a sudden, absolute authority that silenced the men around him. "We'll do it her way." He turned to Jed. "Get every man you can spare. Take shovels, wet blankets. To the creek bed. Now." He looked at Theda. His eyes filled with a desperate, dawning awe. "Tell us what to do." Rescue was a desperate, smoke-choked battle against time. Theda directed the men with a calm authority that belied the inferno racing toward them. They dug a shallow trench along the western edge of the creek bed, creating a line they would not allow the backfire to cross. Nate worked beside her, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face grim. He didn't question her once. He took her direction, passing her orders to the men, his trust in her absolute. He watched her read the wind. Her eyes narrowed against the stinging smoke and realized this was her hidden strength. Not just mending fences, but understanding the land, seeing its patterns, its dangers, and its salvation. With torches made from oil-soaked rags, they set the grass along the creek bed alight. The new fire, smaller and more controlled, raced eastward, driven by the same wind that was pushing the wildfire toward them. For a terrifying 20 minutes, they were trapped between two walls of flame. The heat was immense, the air thick with embers and choking ash. They used the wet blankets to beat out sparks that jumped the trench, their faces raw from the heat, their lungs burning. And then it happened. The two fires met. With a final furious roar, the flames surged high into the air as they consumed the last of the fuel between them, and then, starved, they began to die. The terrifying orange wall collapsed into smoldering, blackened earth. They had done it. They had saved the ranch. As the dawn broke, casting a gray, spectral light over the scorched landscape, the townspeople who had gathered on the far ridge to watch the ranch burn saw an unbelievable sight. The Circle Inn ranch house stood untouched, an island of safety surrounded by a sea of blackened prairie. The fire was out. And standing in the middle of the soot-covered, exhausted group of men was the woman they had scorned. Nate walked toward Theda through the haze. She was leaning on a shovel, her face smudged with black, her dress singed at the hem. She looked up as he approached, her gray eyes weary but clear. He stopped in front of her, oblivious to his men, to the townspeople watching from a distance, to Mrs. Gable, whose face was a thunderous portrait of thwarted malice. He saw only the woman who had saved him. She had not just saved his ranch. She had saved him from his own cold, fearful heart. He reached out and took her hand. It was rough and stained with soot, but it felt like an anchor in his unsteady world. "My fence has been broken for a long time," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'd be honored if you'd stay and help me fix it for good." It wasn't a proposal. It was a plea. It was a public declaration, an irreversible choice made in front of the community that had tried to tear them apart. He was choosing her truth, her strength over their lies. Theda looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Redemption Creek, she let herself believe she might have finally found her home. A slow, tired, beautiful smile spread across her face. "I think I can do that," she said. 3 months later, the prairie was healing. Tiny shoots of green pushed their way through the blackened soil, a stubborn promise of renewal. The line shack at the edge of town stood empty. Theda and Thomas now lived in the main house of the Circle Inn. The whispers in town had died down, replaced by a grudging, then genuine, respect. The story of the fire and the woman who had stopped it had become a local legend, and Mrs. Gable's social pronouncements no longer carried the same weight. Theda stood on the wide front porch, watching Thomas and Lily chase grasshoppers in the yard. Lily's laughter, once a rare and precious sound, was now a common melody at the ranch. The house, once filled with a quiet gloom, now felt warm, alive. Theda had mended more than fences and tack. She had mended a family. She ran a hand along the smooth wood of the porch railing Nate had just finished sanding. He was always building things for her, small, unspoken gestures of love. A new shelf in the kitchen for her jars of preserved vegetables from the thriving garden. A small, sturdy stool so Tom the water pump. A window box outside her bedroom, which he'd filled with wild primrose. She heard his footsteps behind her, the familiar sound of his boots on the wooden planks. He came to stand beside her, not speaking, just sharing the view. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. He slipped his arm around her waist, his touch warm and solid at the small of her back. It was a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. He had never said the words, "I love you." He didn't need to. He said it in the way he looked at her, in the way he trusted her, in the way he had stood against the world for her. "The new grass is coming in strong," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. "It will," she replied softly. "The roots run deep." He tightened his hold, pulling her closer, against his side. He was no longer the cold, closed-off man she had first met. The guilt he carried had not vanished, but it no longer defined him. She had helped him find his way back, just as he had given her a place to finally set down her burdens. They had rescued each other from the fires of the past. Looking out at the vast, peaceful land, at the children playing, at the solid house at her back and the strong man by her side, Theda knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she was finally truly home.